Thank you, Chase. The 1950s was considered a decade of champions. Many teams won multiple championships throughout the decade. Here are some of the players and champions of the 1950s. The 1950s were considered the golden age of baseball. In the decade, New York seemed to dominate along with a win for the Braves. The Yankees won an amazing 6 times and the Dodgers won before and after the move to California. The two stars that are most recognized in the 1950s were the fielders Willie Mays and Jackie Robinson. Both are outstanding hitters that broke records. Willie Mays led the Giants for their World Series win, and Jackie Robinson led the Dodgers for a win as well. During the 1950s, the Cleveland Browns and Detroit Lions were the two leading teams in the decade. Both teams won 3 championships during the decade. The Baltimore Colts were also a powerful team, finishing off the decade with 2 wins. The Los Angeles Rams and New York Giants were also among these great champions in the 1950s. The player that seemed to shine the brightest was Jim Brown. He led the Cleveland Browns to their championship wins. He was considered the greatest running back of all time to many. In the 1950s, Canada had basically all the Stanley Cup winners of the decade. The 1950s was the decade for the Montreal Canadiens. The Canadiens managed to bring home the Stanley Cup 6 times in the decade. The Canadiens players managed to break almost all the records. The records continued to be unbroken for many years to come. Along with Montreal, the Detroit Red Wings had also some of the best years. The Red Wings managed to bring home 3 cups as well. The final team that won was the Toronto Maple Leafs. Their cup win started off the decade. There were 2 players that broke the most records during this decade. This included Gordie Howe and Maurice Rocket Richard. Gordie Howe led the Red Wings while Richard led the Montreal Canadiens to their wins. The 1950s was a thrilling decade for betting in the Kentucky Derby. This decade included some of the most talented horses in Derby history, like Middle Ground, Count Turf, Hillgale, Dark Star, and Determined. Each horse took home a victory. The races were each intense and fast-paced. They seemed to each leave you on the edge of your seat. Some of the winners would create records that wouldn't be broken until the next decade. Unfortunately, for many of the winning horses, they would soon have to retire due to injuries like the champion Dark Star. The 1950s was the beginning of the Lakers and Celtics winning histories. The Minneapolis Lakers scored in 4 victories in the 1950s. The Boston Celtics brought home 2 for themselves. Along with these great teams were the Rochester Royals, Syracuse Nationals, St. Louis Hawks, and even the Philadelphia Warriors. Each team put up amazing seasons and fierce competition. The players that led their teams to victory the most was Dolph Schayes and Neil Johnston. Dolph led the Nationals to their 1955 victory, and Neil Johnston led the Philadelphia Warriors in the 1956 championship. Both players are still known today as one of the best in NBA history. Well, that's all I got. Now back to Chase.